This is Democracy,
a podcast about the people of the United States.
A podcast about citizenship,
about engaging with politics and the world around you.
A podcast about educating yourself on today's important issues
and how to have a voice in what happens next.
Welcome to our new episode of This is Democracy. Today we're going to focus on a very immediate issue, an issue with a long historical tale, but an issue that affects many of our listeners, in fact, today. The challenges of finding an affordable renting situation in our society today. Many people are struggling throughout our cities, Austin, New York City, San Francisco, many other places, to be able to afford rent, to be able to rent an apartment or a house in a way that's affordable based on their income and based on their circumstances. And we are fortunate today to be joined by someone who's doing some of the most important work on this topic. She's devoted, it looks like, much of her career to studying these issues and taking action to empower renters and empower them to make a change and find better legal protection for their needs. This is Shoshana Krieger. She's the project director at BASTA, which is an acronym for Building and Strengthening Tenant Action, based here in Austin and part of the Texas RioGrande Legal Aid. Shoshana has a strong background in this. What BASTA does is it works with Austin renters and their neighbors to ensure that all Austinites have access to safe and affordable housing by facilitating the development of tenant associations, which is important, so tenants have their voices heard, and building renter power in Austin. And again, this is a phenomenon we're seeing across cities, and I know BASTA's connected to that. They target slumlords who profit off of renting substandard properties, the conditions of which negatively impact the health of families. Before working here in Austin, Shoshana was a staff attorney at Neighborhood Legal Services of Los Angeles County, so she worked on these issues there. And she was also a tenants' rights organizer at the good old Lower East Side. She has a JD and an MA in urban planning from UCLA, so she's clearly probably more qualified to talk about these issues than almost anyone else. Shoshana, thank you for joining us today.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Before we turn to our discussion with Shoshana, of course, we have Zachary's scene-setting poem. What's your poem title today, Zachary?
They say a house is just a metaphor.
I can't wait to hear it. Let's hear it.
They say a house is just a metaphor, that home is where the heart is, as if the end of poverty is merely where the start is. When young, we learn a home is what you pledge allegiance to, that poets find a house among their boundless lovers' arches, as if truth is merely that which we give credence to, as if a house is just an artifact we misconstrue. But a house is not an artifact, a flag, or an embrace. A homeland's not a homeland if you cannot find a place. A house may be four walls, a toilet, and a bed, but you've no hope of poetry if your young ones are not fed. And if we can't think of a better way than what's been said, then the metaphor can be put to sleep. Instead, give the house to the mom on the street.
Powerful, Zachary. What is your poem about?
Well, my poem is really about getting beyond the very superficial language and euphemisms we use to describe the housing crisis in the United States, and really getting to the heart of the matter, which is that people just can't find a place to live safely and stay healthy in our society.
Right. And you've made this personal as well as systemic at the same time in your description. Shoshana, how should we begin to understand this issue? A lot of my students have told me that they struggle with rent, but then others who live in my neighborhood where we're homeowners often don't know about this. How do we explain this crisis to people who are not immediately affected by it?
Well, I think one of the things which we've seen over the past few decades is an increase, a dramatic increase in folks who are housing insecure, and folks who are paying not just more than a third of their income towards rent, which is what the federal government would call being housing cost burdened, but are even paying more than 50% of their rent, 50% of their income towards rent. And so I think that even though there are many folks who are not directly impacted by the affordable housing crisis right now, in the next 5 or 10 years, likely those folks are going to encounter loved ones in their lives who are being impacted by this crisis, or themselves are going to be directly impacted by this crisis, whether that be kids who are graduating from high school and college and going out on their own and trying to find a place to live and being confronted with skyrocketing rents. So they have to go and live with mom and dad, or other loved ones and family members who their housing cost burden might be in the form of property taxes and mortgage payments, and their house could be foreclosed upon. And that we are seeing the trend lines are in the direction of unaffordability, sadly, not in the direction of affordability.
And how many families are affected? Do we have some approximation?
We do. I do not have those numbers.
Okay.
Those numbers memorized.
And they're growing. The number of people affected, you said the trend lines are growing, right?
The trend lines are growing. The National Low Income Housing Coalition just put out their annual numbers on how much in each city would you have to make to be able to afford a 1-bedroom or 2-bedroom apartment. And here in Austin, I think it was $25 or $26 an hour would have to be the minimum wage to be able to afford an apartment here. And of course, our minimum wage is the federal minimum wage.
Right. So under that analysis, I mean, it might even be hard for a school teacher or a firefighter, let alone someone working in fast food, to be able to afford a just decent small place to live in a city like Austin, right?
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And you have $15 an hour minimum wage campaigns and living wage campaigns, which are so important. But just seeing that disconnect, right? That even struggling to get $15 an hour standards nationally is something which is still quite a fight. And then when we actually look at the numbers for the cost of housing, there's a disconnect. So if we can't even get ourselves to $15 an hour as a minimum wage, when our housing costs in Austin are would be over $25 an hour you'd have to make, there's something really wrong with that situation. And we're a very long way from solving the affordability problem.
So how has COVID exacerbated this crisis?
I think COVID has laid bare the crisis, that it has exacerbated it, but a lot of what COVID has done and the conversations and the headlines which we're seeing around this crisis are actually pointing to a crisis which has existed for a long time, but we have, as a society, just conveniently ignored. COVID has impacted the lowest wage workers the most. So I think that this there's a connection, right, between poverty and the housing crisis and high housing costs, and that with COVID, lots of folks who we work with day in and day out had their hours reduced, they lost their jobs for periods of time, and they were living paycheck to paycheck. So they may have at this point rebounded. They maybe have employment now, but they had a month or 2 or 3 or 4 where they were without work or had fewer hours. And because they don't have savings, and because it's impossible to save given the wages they currently earn, that amount of rental arrears continues to persist.
And building on that, Shoshana, I wanted to also ask about the freeze we had in Texas in the spring, because I know your organization, BASTA, was heroic in trying to bring water to people. Even some of my students were recipients of your heroic work and help. But how did that affect the situation? People in units they could barely afford, then having to go a week without water, without power. What consequence did that have that you've seen?
Well, I mean, there was the immediate aftermath of just widespread water outages at multifamily properties throughout the city, which persisted long after water was restored officially on the maps that Austin Water was putting out, because the issue at that point wasn't that the utility wasn't providing the water. The issue was that there were broken pipes and other infrastructure issues at the properties, which was causing there not to be water. I mean, there were some properties where it was 3 weeks, a month that they didn't have water, and landlords did very little to try to get their residents water. And instead, the nonprofit sector, with assistance from government, were the primary providers of water during that time. And those landlords where the outages were 3 weeks, 4 weeks, there was a lot of damage at those properties. And the fact that it happened at those particular properties was also no accident. Though what we've seen is that even now, 5 months after the storm, we're working at properties where there was significant damage, and most of these properties also had long-standing outages. And these were properties which were in disrepair long before the storm hit. And so that when then we had the winter storm, these properties weren't able to be resilient against the storm because infrastructure and maintenance infrastructure had not been maintained. And this all, in the end, I think does connect to this affordability crisis and the affordability problem, because one of the reasons that landlords are able to get away with having properties in such terrible condition is that they're able to find renters who are willing to live in those conditions because there are no other options. And that a lot of these properties are also in areas which are gentrifying, which means landlords are making a very specific calculation and are speculating and are saying, why am I going to put in money to make repairs at this property right now when I know 5 years from now I'm going to flip it and there's going to be a total gut rehab. So I'm not really investing in something which is long term. It's better to just not make the repairs, take the rent, because I have plenty of people who will rent, and then wait it out to the moment when I can cash in and make bank. I think your initial question was how has that exacerbated the housing crisis, on top of the pandemic? And I think just in terms of lived experience of renters, you have folks who were already living paycheck to paycheck, if that. Many already had arrears because of the pandemic. And so landlords used existing loopholes. Austin still has many local protections on evictions because of COVID, but there are some loopholes in those protections in the event of a natural disaster. So we saw landlords using those loopholes just to get the tenants who are behind on rent out, so to sidestep those protections. And then just tenants had, had less of a safety net because they had less savings. Their family members had less savings, and their friends and their community to be able to make a move to be able to get out. And in Texas, there are very few protections for tenants who find themselves in a damaged unit. And landlords really can almost unilaterally terminate leases with very little notice to tenants, and tenants are just out of luck. So that compounds kind of the injustice which tenants experienced during the storm.
No, and I will say I saw this firsthand. One of my graduate students, this is someone in a PhD program who's a high-performing, highly educated person. She was in one of the units you just described, a overpriced, under-maintained apartment complex on the east side of Austin. She lives there with her husband because they couldn't find something else that was affordable and close to campus. And I think she was 3 weeks without water. And what was most disconcerting to me is there was no communication from the landlord and very little effort to repair things. Finally, I convinced my student to call her city council person. And the city council person's office then contacted the landlord, and magically the day after they came and repaired the water and had the water running. And it shouldn't have to work that way. And I think it reflects what you're saying. And here is someone who's, at what we would call upper middle class. This is not even a poor person struggling, and we can only imagine what others are going through. Shoshana, in some ways, this is an old story, right? As historians, we know landlords in the United States and in other societies have always tried to exploit. They have an incentive in a certain way, in many cases, to exploit tenants. It is an Old English story as well. What has made it worse in recent years? What are the sources, or why have we backtracked from what we thought was progress we had made through the Federal Housing Authority and other entities in the 70s and 80s? What's happened recently?
Well, I think you're right that this is an old story. And I mean, this is a story of capitalism, and this is the story of us as a society seeing human not as a human, seeing housing not as a human right, but as a commodity. I think in recent years, though, what we've seen is a influx of global capital into the rental housing market. And we've also seen a increase in corporate ownership of rental housing. And we saw that in the single family sector right after the financial crisis of the 2000s, where we saw a few very big players just buying up recently foreclosed properties and becoming one of the largest landlords. So taking properties out of the kind of mom and pop rental market and having these large corporate landlords of single family housing. And we also see that in the multifamily market. And so what that means is that the landlords then are even more disconnected from their properties, because oftentimes the landlords are just these murky entities, which are very hard to even find who is in control of, let alone hold the individuals controlling those companies accountable. And it also means that, when you have landlords who are in California or Vancouver or Nashville, I'm just rattling off some of the places where the landlords of properties we're organizing live. They're so far away. It's a lot harder to hold them accountable. That you were talking about the call from your student to the council member, and then the council member got involved. Well, it's a lot harder to get for a council member to even advocate for a tenant if the landlord is very far away, because the landlord just doesn't have as much to lose, right? And so it makes them even less accountable, and it makes housing into more of a commodity and less of a home, right? That it's not in the kind of quaint picture we have of a landlord-tenant relationship is one guy who has, a couple of extra properties on his hand, and then he comes by and collects the rent every month, and he sees the kids grow, and he has this kind of benevolent relationship, and if that family's struggling, right, because he has a relationship with them, he'll give them a bit more time, and he's a human. But that's increasingly not the relationship of landlords to tenants in America.
Right. It sounds more like a call center where you're the tenant, just like the person using the computer that's not working, and you're calling the call center and you're waiting and you can't get anyone on the phone, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Zachary, you had a question on that?
Yeah, my question is really, why has the media, if we want to treat it as sort of one large entity, seem to ignore this problem for so long? I mean, it seems to have had such a huge influence, not just on individual members of our society, but our political discourse. I mean, just the fact that our president was the child of slumlords, as Jeremy read in your bio.
I think that, it's a really good question. I think a lot of that has to do with classism and racism. So in Austin, 70% of Black Austinites are renters, and 65% of Latinx Austinites are renters, and then 55% of all Austinites are renters. So we're a majority renter city, but a disproportionate number of folks who are communities of color are renters. And also poorer people are renters. So 75% of Austinites who earn less than $75,000 a year are renters. And so with just like, political power, right, and why kind of our poverty programs are what they are, right? There are many larger kind of systemic reasons for that. I think it's similar to this affordability crisis of that those in the media there's a disconnect in terms of race and class of those reporting on stories than kind of the stories which need to be covered.
And what do you think about the argument that's often made here in Austin and in other cities that the problem is a problem of supply and that the solution is in the market, which I think is something different from what you're saying, of just building more stuff? And this is often the argument made for gentrification. It's the argument developers make all the time. What's your response to that argument?
I think that argument is a simplistic argument. I think both sides of that argument are simplistic arguments because obviously we need more supply, but supply alone isn't going to be the magical solution. We through the history of rental housing in this country, landlords haven't just acted benevolently because they could. We had tenements, 100 years ago, right? And so, regulation is a key to curbing bad behavior across the board. And humans, humans are humans. And then especially in a capitalist society, in a society in which we value individualism over almost anything else. I think that there are ways to get supply while at the same time ensuring that a certain percentage of that housing is affordable, but oftentimes overlooked in conversations around affordability and how are we producing more affordable housing is also what are the standards for tenants in that housing which is produced. Because in just baseline tax credit housing, which is most of the low-income affordable housing which is built today, there are very few additional protections for tenants other than what exists under normal state laws. So in a state like Texas, if you are in a low-income housing tax credit unit, you don't have a right to organize with your neighbors. And so that's something we see all the time where folks we're working with end up getting kicked out of the properties, or we get kicked out of the properties which they're at, because they don't like that tenants are pointing out the fact that repairs are needed and that the manager is a bully and that the towing policies are unfair and likely unlawful. And we as a society could say, hey, if we are subsidizing this housing, we want to make sure there's a standard set of protections. And if a municipality is saying, okay, we're going to upzone this property in exchange for you giving a certain percentage of units, allocating a certain percentage of units as affordable, part of that conversation should also be, okay, what are the protections the tenants living in that property are going to have? Because really, if we're talking about like longer systems change and how are we shifting power and building power, which is fundamentally what BASTA does, and our lens is about with everything we do, it's about how are we building power long term. That means we need to be shifting some of the structures, not just saying, okay, we have a few more units. If the folks in those units can't organize, if the folks in those units don't have leverage to be able to demand repairs, aren't allowed to renew their lease, there aren't actual caps on the rent increases, then those affordable units are pretty meaningless.
Right. And I think, Shoshana, that echoes beautifully one of the main themes of our podcast each week, which is that democracy as a concept means that there is an essential role for government, local, state, and national, to play in regulating the interactions between different actors in the market, that an unregulated market often becomes undemocratic. And one of the lessons from Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, our inspiration for the podcast, is that there's a very positive and essential role for government to play in a democracy. I think that leads directly into the sort of last set of questions we had, which is what are you through BASTA trying to do, and what do you see as the solutions, if there are any, or at least the elements of progress we can make going forward?
So BASTA, as the solution, BASTA sees organizing is the solution. That organizing and engaging folks who are the most directly impacted into crafting and advancing the solutions. And that if we aren't engaging new folks, if we aren't building power, both tenant power and then political power, then we aren't going to be able to demand the necessary, well, we may be able to demand, but we're not going to be able to successfully demand and have those demands met, regulatory changes which are needed. And at the end of the day, having community control over the development process. And when I'm saying community control, community control is thrown around all the time, and oftentimes is used by homeowners in single family neighborhoods to say, we are the community, right? And who is community? And that's a huge question. But when I'm saying community control, I'm talking about the people who are living in the multifamily housing,
right,
who are renters, right? Like a broader community of folks being able to have autonomy over the places they're living. And that kind of goes back to the poem at the beginning of this podcast, right? What's a home and what's a house? And I would say that to have a home, a house which is a home, you need to have autonomy over it. And so we're working to organize at individual properties, communities of tenants who then can collectively prioritize the issues they want to work on and collectively strategize on how to win campaigns which prioritize those issues. And that's really in the weeds on the ground. And a lot of times the campaigns we're doing are about one particular manager who everyone hates and doesn't treat people with dignity, or it's about one property we're at. The big thing, which is getting everyone, is wind chimes. They're not allowed to put up wind chimes. And that says a lot about what the feeling of not having autonomy in your home, right? And what people want is to be able to be like, I want to be able to have plants, and I want to be able to kind of have my own mark on my home. And those issues are a long way from broader, how are we making sure that government is regulating the market? But for BASTA, engaging folks at that level, meeting people really where they're at, is the first step to bringing them into a larger movement where we're having those conversations. And that's where some of our citywide work is at. But you have to do all of it. You can't just go into those communities and be like, okay, like, let's talk about community control over the land. People are gonna be like, yo, I have like this light in front of my house is broken and there's been 2 robberies there in the last 3 weeks. Like, don't talk to me about like these larger, amorphous issues.
Sure.
Talk to me about immediate solutions.
It sounds so much like bread and butter civil rights organizing, where you're connecting with the community, you're building a beloved community, and you're motivating people to come together to make the demands for their basic humanity that are being denied. It's a very powerful historical way to raise awareness, because it's not about debating one policy detail or another. It's about the humanity of those who are suffering in these units right now. It's a very powerful way to approach things. Are you finding success?
We are finding success. I think you have to embrace the small victories, and the small victories is what fuels larger victories. At North Lamar Mobile Home Park, which is a 68 lot mobile home park in kind of north central Austin. In the middle of the pandemic, we supported that association in purchasing their community as a co-op from their owner. And that was after a 5-year campaign. And that they now have control over their community. There are headaches with that control, but they do. We're supporting right now another association where the families were about to be displaced because of the winter storm damage. 5 months later, the landlords were saying they had to leave, and after the tenants organized, the landlord withdrew those notices of termination, and now we're working on getting a temporary relocation process, which is working, right? And in that process, we're developing relationships with people, and folks are from other campaigns we've worked at other places, right, are supporting and in solidarity with this existing campaign. We'll see where it goes. But the folks who are organizing at this property are going to link into our work into the future, and are going to be able to inform future campaigns and hopefully build upon this relocation agreement that we get. So the next one will be even better than this one. And it's kind of that small incremental growth, which is a victory. It's also exhausting.
Sure.
It's not, we don't have magic bullets and we don't have magic wands.
This is always the challenge for activism. It's maintaining the energy for the long haul. But it sounds like you guys are doing incredible work. Zachary, as a young person who lives in Austin and visits other cities and sees this issue in front of you, when it's a matter of talking to people who are struggling to pay their rent, when we see homelessness in front of us, does the work that BASTA is doing and what Shoshana's described to you, is that something that could motivate young people like you to get involved and think about these issues?
I think so. You mentioned the resemblance to civil rights activism, but to me, it's also it also deeply resembles labor activism. And I think that part of the story of the past few decades has been that we sort of let those institutions that bring communities together and allow them to negotiate for better conditions. We've let those institutions be torn apart by profit interests, etc. And I think part of the way forward out of this moment of inequality is to rebuild those institutions.
Right, within government and outside of government,
exactly.
Too. Right. Sure.
I would also say there's the institution, there's also just the communal institutions, right? Like just our churches and just institutions for social cohesion, which have broken down. And that's one of the reasons I love working with tenants and tenants associations, is a lot of that work is about creating groups and creating community space, and of neighbors knowing neighbors. And so I think part of the healing is also just through human connection and being able to see everyone around you as someone who is part of your community, where you're feeling kind of that love and human connection. And that's something which really we're in desperate need of right now.
Right. The scholarship on social activism is so powerful on this, and echoing what you just said, which is that social movements that endure tend to be ones where people feel a close interpersonal connection, sort of like soldiers in a military, right? They feel connected to the person next to them, and that keeps them motivated when they're tired and they're disillusioned. And it sounds like you're building exactly that model of activism at the community level. Shoshana, last question. If people want to get involved and want to learn more, where should they go?
So they can go to our website, which is www.bastaAustin, BASTAAUSTIN.org. You can also follow us on social media. We're probably most active right now on Facebook, and that's at BASTA Austin. And we have a number of resources also on our local eviction protections in Austin and the Eviction Solidarity Network, which we're an anchor of. So if folks are living in Austin, listeners are living in Austin and are concerned about potential evictions, definitely check that out. And it has a lot of educational materials on what your rights are.
And what about those not in Austin? Are there national entities they can look to, or where should they go?
So BASTA is part of the Right to the City Alliance and their Homes for All campaign. I'm not actually sure their website offhand, offhand, but you can Google Right to the City Alliance. And there are a number of dozens of groups throughout the country who organize the way we do, and sometimes slightly differently than the way we do, but they're comrades and allies in the struggle. And that has a map of all of the different local organizations. And I think, one thing which we kind of touched on, but the struggle with kind of tenants' rights and housing justice activism is that a lot of the issues and the problems are global and national problems, but most of our solutions from a policy standpoint are local solutions. It's about zoning. It's about landlord tenant regulation. And so that makes it an even tougher nut to crack. And that's why alliances like Right to the City's Homes for All coalition becomes so important, because it's really translocal, connecting different local groups who are all experiencing the same thing and creating spaces for us to be able to both share ideas and also to nurture each other and to learn from each other.
Sure. Well, Shoshana, thank you so much for all that you do and for sharing these insights with us. And I want to encourage our listeners to follow up and learn more about these issues. This is something that affects us all, whether we are renters or not. And it's also just such an important manifestation of civil rights organizing and labor organizing today, as Zachary said. Thank you for joining us, Shoshana.
Thank you for having me.
Zachary, thank you too for your poem and your insights. And most of all, thank you to our listeners for joining us for this week of This Is Democracy.
This podcast is produced by the Liberal Arts ITS Development Studio
and the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin.
The music in this episode was written and recorded by Harris Codini.
Stay tuned for a new episode every week.
You can find This Is Democracy on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher.
See you next time.